Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. Today's presentation is 5 practices of exemplary leadership, an approach for advocacy and community within the Black community, presented by James Rujimura and Timothy Eng. If you guys have any questions throughout, you can feel free to put them in the chat. And please remember that at the end of this session, you will be sent an email with a link to a survey. If you complete the survey, that's how you get your continuing education credits. If you have any questions, let us know. Off to you guys.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Go for it, Tim.
Awesome. Have you shared your screen? Or while James shares his screen, my name is Tim. I am a second-year doctoral student at the cusp of entering candidacy at the University of Central Florida. And I'll allow my colleague to introduce himself.
Yes, indeed. Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is James Rujimura, and I am also a doctoral student at the University of Central Florida. I'm also on the cusp of doctoral candidacy.
Yeah, and before we get this presentation started, I'd love for those who have joined us either in the chat or if you'd like to unmute yourselves, we'd love to get to know what population you are, whether you're students, counselor educators, and what population you see yourself working with. So we'll take a couple minutes for y'all to respond in the chat or by unmuting yourself. And as we wait for awesome, Joey, I see that you're a student with an undecided specialty. Thank you for your response. Another student looking to work with children and families. Thank you. And as we let a couple more responses come in, I think it's important that before we begin this presentation that James and I acknowledge our positionality as individuals who are not part of the Black community. In addition to this, I also think it's important that we provide a trigger warning for the topics that we'll discuss in this presentation as it relates to racism, discrimination, and interaction with law enforcement that impact this community. And so we ask that for those who are in attendance, feel free to turn off your cameras and or step away as needed. So yeah, other than that, as it relates to the population, we're hoping that out of this presentation, you take this model and apply it to the populations that you see fit. So as we start, James, if you can go to the next slide. Okay, so the objectives of this presentation, for the next 50-ish minutes or so, we are going to cover some learning outcomes, some issues that we've highlighted within the Black community. We will cover the model that we use to provide some assistance for working with members of this community, the 5 practices of exemplary leadership. We'll also cover how to apply the model and then implications for counselors moving forward to work with this community or other marginalized or oppressed populations. Next slide. So learning outcomes today. After today, we'd love for everyone to walk away with being able to identify some issues that we've highlighted within this community, the Black community, that impede on their health, education, relationship with law enforcement, and their mental health. We'd also like for everyone in attendance to gain an understanding of the model, the 5 practices of exemplary leadership, and how this can be applied in the either this population or other marginalized and oppressed populations. So as we begin this presentation, it's important that we also acknowledge that for the purpose of applying this model, we did highlight 5 issues. These are not, these issues that we've highlighted are not the sole issues that the Black community experience, but we wanted to highlight 5 of them to show how this model can be applied. And so this presentation really came from the civil unrest in 2020 and the murder of George Floyd, and how we wanted to call attention to the unique challenges that this community faces when it comes to their education, healthcare, employment, and the relationship with law enforcement. We understand that the social, cultural, and political implications of race and ethnicity are of utmost importance to counselors. It is in our standards and our ethical code. And so we wanted to highlight and acknowledge how we can become advocates for this community. So the 5 issues that we identified that are experienced by the Black community, the first one is racism. So the Black community has endured a long and tenuous relationship with racism. And although it's not as explicit or exclusionary as, say, the Jim Crow era, presently, the Black community experiences interpersonal and systemic racism. And so when I say interpersonal racism, what I mean is racial profiling and other forms of systemic racism can include like healthcare disparities. So inequitable access and treatment in these areas create challenges that impact the mental health and is exclusively found in this community due to America's historical past that was forged in racism and discriminatory laws. The Jim Crow era established laws that prohibited the Black community from receiving the same quality education, healthcare, and employment opportunities as white and other majority populations. And while the abolishment of Jim Crow laws made way for the passing of the Civil Rights Act, the Black community still faces other forms of covert racism that have evolved into traditionally oppressive practices that have in some ways subtly maintained the disenfranchisement, segregation, and disproportional rates of because of systemic and structural biases. The other issue we wanted to highlight is education. So the Black community has historically been denied equitable access to education, which has led to severe inequalities of rates of employment, retention, degree completion, all at the post-secondary level. And research in this area has also shown underwhelming success due to funding, policy changes, and lack of resources for schools in urban and deep rural areas where Black people tend to reside. And in addition to this, the underrepresentation of Black educators has also contributed to feelings of isolation and disconnection, which may explain those disproportionate levels of academic underperformance in university settings in compared to other races. The third issue we highlighted is oppression. And so within some Black communities, low access to adequate education and generational poverty has partly been responsible for the divide in economic mobility for this community. And intergenerational poverty among the Black community stems from decades long of high unemployment rates between races. And although in recent years, unemployment rates of members of this community have improved in comparison to white and Asian counterparts, this community still struggles to compete in job markets. And consequently, the inadequate access and opportunity to either jobs and higher education really strongly influence this income disparity, which continues to oppress this community and continue to prolong the generational poverty. And so what we see there is a direct relationship between how education and employability impede on their ability for upward financial mobility in ways where they can secure health insurance and reside in higher income communities where there are more access to resources in education and healthcare. The fourth bullet, prejudice. So in addition to challenges in education, healthcare, the Black community has had notoriously higher rates of interaction with law enforcement, where there have been more instances of lethal force and fatal occurrences than any other race. This community is more often the target of racial discrimination that has led to vast inequalities in incarceration rates and premature death at the hands of the police. So we see how this community is treated unfairly at the hands of law enforcement and in the judicial system, which occurs in the higher rates of imprisonment. As a result of this, the relationship between the Black community and law enforcement continues to be strained as this community experiences racial profiling, over-policing, and hyper-surveillance. And the last issue that we wanted to highlight within this community is that they've been systemically hurt by medical establishment. This is evidenced by pervasive stereotypes and stigma when they are seeking care, denial of health care, coupled with individual and systemic biases, has led to an increase in race-based stress, depression, and anxiety in this community. And similarly, as mentioned before, the low employment rates have contributed to the limited or no healthcare coverage, which has an impact on their mental health care. So the 5 issues that I've highlighted very briefly are challenges that this community faces at the individual, community, systemic, and structural level that have manifested themselves onto the mental health of this community.
Great. So before we move on, I just wanted to check the chat. Tim, can you check the chat and see if there are any questions and open it up
Sure.
for questions? Just because I would have to take off the presentation.
Sure.
And then we can move forward.
We're good to go so far, but I'll continue to monitor it as it comes in.
Cool. Awesome. So I want to thank Tim for providing that background information about issues that are present within the Black community. Like Tim said, that there are more issues, unfortunately, with this community and also with other marginalized and oppressed communities too. And we have to find ways to mitigate these issues, right? As counselors, as counselor educators, we have a variety of hats that we have, whether it's clinician, whether it's professor, teacher, whether it's supervisor. One of the hats that is salient to my identity as a counselor educator is leadership, to be a leader, and we are called in our profession to be leaders and advocates. And so I say all of that because when we talk about leadership, usually people stray away from leadership roles because they don't think that they're a leader, or they think, oh, I am no one special that I can lead anybody through anything, especially regarding such heavy, weighty topics and issues that we're discussing today. But I would challenge all of you that you can be a leader in your own different ways through the 5 practices of exemplary leadership. And the 5 practices are really born out of transformational leadership. And there are essentially 5 components that you can take on at any point of your career, of your schooling. And we have chosen to take on these practices when we work with, when we supervise, when we teach members of the Black community, but we can also extend that to other communities as well. So this is a very brief overview of the 5 practices. It's model the way, challenge the process, inspire a shared vision, enable others to act, and encourage the heart. So when we think about model the way, this is essentially the golden rule, right? Treat others as you wish to be treated. And that's an aspirational thing that we can all aspire to, because unfortunately in practice, that may not always be the case, but at least we share that vision of we are working towards our actions speaking louder than our words, and our behaviors and our demeanor and our disposition are modeling the way and how we act in our variety of hats that we put on. The second practice is challenge the process. And this is something that we do as advocates in the profession all the time, right? We're always looking for ways to change the status quo. We're looking for opportunities where we question, why do we do that? What is the tradition behind that? And does that still make sense given contemporary societal needs and desires? So we're always looking for ways to improve, to experiment, to take risks. And that essentially summarizes challenge the process. The third practice is inspire shared vision. We are working towards creating a vision where everybody's well-being and health is accounted for, and we have practices that are both equal and equitable. And so as counselors, we breathe life into this vision and the work that we do and the advocacy work that we do and all of the hats that we have. And we get people excited. This is the motivation perspective of this framework. And then we have enable others to act, right? We are in the profession of counseling because we believe in relationships. We believe in the connections that we make with others. And so we foster that collaboration. We build teams. We involve others to create this atmosphere based off of trust and strength, because we believe in the goodness of people. And so we enlist the help of others to create that shared vision. And then finally, encourage the heart. We know that tackling any kind of issue, any kind of problem or challenge can be really hard and tough sometimes. And it can be deflating. It can be disappointing because there's a lot of setbacks along the way towards positive, sustainable change. But we have to keep the hope and determination alive to continually work at mitigating these issues that we all experience or experience in some way or form. And that looks like recognizing and celebrating the group and individual accomplishments. So to summarize, these are the 5 practices that we'll be talking about. And then in subsequent slides, we'll be showing you how these 5 practices can apply to the issues that Tim had mentioned earlier. Before I move forward, though, I want to pause and give space to anyone that might have a question about these practices, because you traditionally don't see this style of leadership or this framework of leadership in counseling and counselor education. So it may be new for some folks.
We're good on questions so far. We have one hand raised. Joey?
Yeah, hi. And this is going to be new to me regardless because I'm a newish student. But I was wondering how, and this may be something you're about to answer as you move through the 5 practices, but as someone who's not ethnically a part of the community that they're advocating for, and especially, learning a lot more about, the movement from feminism to womanism, because a lot of African American women really felt left out of that whole movement and conversation and empowerment. How would you, whether you're going to be in a leadership role or merely, a soldier role or ally role, how do you, how do you navigate that sensitively?
Yeah, I can give my perspective on it, and then Tim, you can share yours as well. But one of the first things that I would do, right, is to acknowledge positionality, right? Who you are, what biases you bring in, what identities that you have that ultimately, in some way, would affect how you work with others and how you collaborate with others. So I always try to acknowledge my positionality in the relationships that I have, because I believe that if you're going to build, just like a therapeutic alliance, if you're going to build a strong relationship with someone else, they need to know what they're getting themselves into, right? And so by you being upfront, honest, authentic, and genuine, it gives them the opportunity to say, hey, do I trust this individual? Do I believe that they're there for me? And that translates into you sharing your vision of what the future looks like. Is it a collaboration? Is it working towards legislation? It's positionality, it's relationship building, and underneath both of that is a genuine authenticity to create change, right? To say, I see that this is a challenge for you and your community, and I want to be there right with you as we explore ways to change what has happened or challenge the status quo.
Yeah, I don't have much to add behind the positionality piece, other than it is very important to acknowledge based on some of the points that James said. And in addition to this, which we'll get into in the following slides, I think um, as it relates to this model and the application of this model, why I really enjoy it is because whether you see yourself as a leader out in front, taking charge, or someone who works behind the scenes, leadership can take many different forms, and applying this model doesn't explicitly have to look like the ways that we are applying it, and it can be tailored to what you see fit based on these 5 practices that we've highlighted. Model the way, challenge the process, inspiring a shared vision. All of these things look different for everyone depending on their leadership style. But I think it's important to acknowledge your positionality, be willing to learn, and acknowledge that you don't know everything there is to know about this community, and allow members from this community or other communities that you want to work with to define the problems that they are experiencing.
It's a really great question. I invite others to bring their questions up as we go along with the presentation. So let's move forward. So just to summarize everything that we've talked about so far, give you a really clear, simple roadmap of where we're going in the latter half of this presentation. how do the 5 practices align with the 5 issues, right? So we talked about model the way, and we feel in this presentation that it aligns with racism, challenge the process, education, inspire shared vision, group economics, enable others to act, law enforcement, encourage the healthcare, and within healthcare is mental health care. And we'll be diving more into each of these alignment in subsequent slides, but just to give you a roadmap of where we're going for the rest of this presentation. So in terms of model the way, we know that unfortunately racism exists. And as Tim mentioned, it's both on the interpersonal and systemic level. The more that we acknowledge its existence, the more that we can take aim at mitigating it. And so when we model the way, we as counselors and counselor educators establish principles and values that inform how individuals should be treated, right? Thankfully, our professional organizations have started that work for us in the form of ethical codes. ACA has them. If you're a school counselor, ASCA has them. And these are the principles and values that we work towards and adhere to, and all of the hats that we wear. And we also model the way by becoming transparent in our adoption of anti-racist policies and working actively to oppose it in all forms, right? And so if we are active and transparent and we let our clients, our students, our legislators know where we stand, we are modeling the way for others on how we can combat not only racism, but really all of the issues that we've mentioned in this presentation. Second, we have challenged the process. And so I have in parentheses, education and discrimination, because those things often go hand in hand. Tim had talked about the underrepresentation of Black and marginal and faculty of color in higher education, and how that's a really not a great thing, because we need representation and we need diversity in the classroom. And so when we challenge the process, right, we're looking at the status quo and we're looking for ways that we can challenge it. And one of the ways that we can do that as counselors is to integrate broaching behavior. And so broaching behavior was built off of the work of Norma Day Vines and how you can facilitate discussions related to race, ethnicity, and culture. And so Tim and I actually demonstrated this at the very beginning of this presentation by broaching the fact that we are not part of the Black community, and we acknowledge our positionality. And so we will never, ever know the true lived experiences of what it means to be Black in this country, right? And so that's an example of broaching the behavior, because otherwise, not challenging the process is letting that go unacknowledged. Another way that you challenge the process within the education system is through curriculum design. We want to ensure that a curriculum and our lessons and activities reflect a social justice paradigm that supports the learning and growth of students. And one of the ways that both Tim and I have experienced this is the inclusion of the multicultural justice competency principles, how that's been integrated into our curriculum at the doctoral level. Speaking for myself, I know when I was in my master's program, that was also integrated into the curriculum as well. And so by adding intentional curriculum design with social justice principles, we are challenging the process of what had been done prior to the creation of these frameworks. Inspire shared vision, right? I have put oppression and income equality. For Tim and I, when we were creating this presentation, like our shared vision was to see a society, to live in a society that is socially just, equitable, and economically accessible, right? That is the vision that we share with others. That is the vision that we share when we're working with our clients, especially our clients who identify as non-white. And what that looks in practice is something called group economics, which is a term that you don't really hear in counseling, but group economics is essentially this practice where you have a bunch of individuals, whether they be counselors or not counselors, and they pool money together towards a common cause, right? And so in Tim and I's presentation, we said, well, couldn't this be applied to access to mental health care? And that's how we inspire the shared vision is how can we defray costs to mental health care for this community? Because we know that cost to mental health care is a significant barrier to people getting the support and help that they need. And so if you're pulling money together, you're pulling resources together, that's a actionable practice of group economics. Because again, we are leading from our shared vision of making society socially just, equitable, and economically accessible. Enable others to act. I had put in parentheses prejudice and law enforcement. This is where we act in collaboration with the Black community. We fully acknowledge that the relationship between the Black community and other communities that identify as non-white is tenuous with law enforcement in this country. And it sometimes gets more tenuous the more we consume media and the media sources that we have. But we also believe that we can work in alignment and engage with law enforcement for collective ownership and responsibility of what's happening, right? We are not saying that we support the police. We're not saying to defund the police. That's not the point of this presentation. That's not the point of enable others to act. It's more, how can we work in collaboration based off of our differences? And that can be really tough for individuals, especially given that potential interactions with law enforcement can be harmful and they can be deadly. And so it's tough. It's really tough. And then finally, encourage the heart. And I had put mental and physical health. When we think about healthcare as counselors, I have always viewed healthcare as both mental and physical health. And so when we encourage the heart, we want to celebrate, affirm, and acknowledge our clients and help them stay motivated and give them hope on navigating their health conditions. Because unfortunately, in a lot of non-white communities, not only is access, but also treatment of physical and mental health illness gets secondhand or is less than optimal, to put it in those terms, right? We know that medication, we know that treatment is not always the most optimal it can be for these marginalized communities. And so what we can do as counselors, as advocates, as leaders, is advocate on our clients' behalf to meet them where they're at in terms of their physical and mental health journey, to give them resources, to show them like, hey, you're not going into that doctor's appointment alone. Like you're going in there with resources, with knowledge, with informed decisions based off of the relationship that we've created. So because that can be a really scary ordeal when you're trying to navigate a complicated healthcare system, knowing full well that you may get less optimal treatment than the individual sitting next to you in the waiting room. And so if we encourage our clients, encourage our individuals to not give hope, to celebrate that they even taking the step to take care of themselves, I think those are small ways that go a long way. All right, Tim, all you.
All right, so the implications for counselors, counselor educators, or those in the helping profession is that by implementing and adapting the 5 practices of exemplary leadership, we use this as a framework that guides and grounds us in connection, leadership, and service to the profession to address um, the issues that we highlighted related to racism, oppression, discrimination in Black communities and other oppressed and marginalized communities. As professionals, we can also imbue transformational leadership by modeling individualistic and systemic changes. The transformational work that is embedded and encompassed in this type of work is enabling and inspiring and challenges status quos and encourages others to continue advocating for this community in addition to other marginalized and oppressed communities. And so what we want is to utilize this framework to work alongside the Black community and other oppressed communities. And so ultimately what we presented and what we want out of this presentation is to provide a framework of leadership for you to be able to apply it to the populations of which you want to serve. And as Joey mentioned, I think going back to that conversation of leadership and how it looks different. I think, again, what is a beautiful and very applicable component of this model is that it acknowledges that leadership looks different in different ways, and you can still advocate alongside or for communities in different ways by applying these 5 practices. And so ultimately, for some last words, if we serve from this model, then it really allows us to serve dually as leaders, to enact a vision for the profession, and also allow us to connect to service. Yeah, servant leadership. Mhm.
All right. And so that concludes our presentation. I do want to leave everyone with the idea that when we think about these practices, these are skills. And because that they are skills, they can be learned and they can be practiced. And we often see leadership as this big, lofty thing that leaders are born and all of this, when really it's just a set of skills that we can practice to work towards a common goal with others. And so my hope for not only this profession, but also for other helping professions is to view leadership in this way of it's something that can be taught. And because it can be taught, I can develop it over the course of the years that I spend on this planet. And they manifest themselves in these 5 practices. And that's it. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to unmute or share in the chat. I know we did end a bit early, but whatever questions you have, we'd be happy to answer them.
Thank you so much, gentlemen. I have a question. I'm not very familiar with UCF. What kind of organizations are already in place on your campus that follow this particular, or is this kind of a faculty-wide, or is this something new for your faculty, the five principles or five, yeah, practices, sorry, of leadership?
Yeah, so to my knowledge, this is not necessarily implemented within our faculty, and that's not that's not uh, that's not to say that they're not practicing leadership in their own way. This is more of a style of leadership that Tim and I subscribe to and what fits best for us. Much like a counseling theory fits best to the individual. This is how we have viewed leadership that both works with our models of the world and view of the world, but also how we view our clients and the students that we work with. So it's not necessarily a university-wide thing or a program-wide thing, but more of a philosophy in how we approach issues.
Thank you. Sorry, I was petting the cat. Thank you very much.
All righty. Well, thank you everyone for taking the time to come to our presentation, to learn from us, to be in community. If you have any further questions, don't hesitate to reach out. We are always happy to talk about this model of leadership and how it applies to the many issues that we unfortunately encounter in our society.
Thank you guys so much for sharing today. I'm going to go ahead and end the call for everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day.